All right, so last time we saw how archaeology supports some of the Bible's details, and now we're going to go a bit further and look at specific historians outside the Bible who confirm key people and events in Jesus' life, ministry, death, and resurrection. You can think of these sources like independent news outlets reporting on the same event, because as you know, when multiple accounts align, it strengthens their credibility. Or in our case, it gives us more confidence that the Bible is reliable. So we are specifically going to focus on Roman and Jewish historians from the first century. These are people who were often hostile towards Christians, which helps. So we're going to start with the Romans. Tacitus was a Roman historian born around 56 AD, and he was known for his detailed writings about the history of Rome and its emperors. His works are called Annals and Histories, and they are important sources for understanding the political and social landscape of the Roman Empire. In his Annals, Tacitus mentions Jesus indirectly when referring to Emperor Nero's persecution of Christians after the fire of Rome in AD 64. Tacitus writes, Nero fastened the guilt for the fire of Rome in AD 64 and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by the sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty, then upon their information an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of wild beasts, they were torn to pieces by dogs, or they were crucified, or, in the case of daylight, were burned to serve as a nightly illumination. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle and was exhibiting a show in the circus while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood in his chariot. So this is an important source because even though Tacitus didn't like Christians, to put it lightly, he still confirms key details from the New Testament, right? He confirms that Jesus, who we referred to as Christus, was the founder of the Christian movement, that Jesus was executed under Pontius Pilate during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius, and he confirms that Christianity began in Judea and spread immensely, and that the early Christians faced brutal persecution under Nero. And this aligns with the gospel accounts of Jesus' execution, as well as the persecution of the early church, which we read a bit more about in Acts and the rest of the New Testament in Romans. And then Tacitus' mention of Nero's persecution of the Christians following the Great Fire of Rome matches other historical accounts of Christian suffering under Nero. Okay, so I want to move on to Suetonius, who is a Roman historian and biographer who lived around 69 AD, and then he wrote extensively about the lives of emperors in his work, The 12 Caesars and the Lives of the Caesars. So Suetonius mentions early Christians, specifically referencing how Emperor Claudius expelled Jews from Rome around 49 AD, and then he writes, because the Jews at Rome caused continuous disturbances at the instigation of Christus, he expelled them from the city. So here, Suetonius' reference to Christus, this is likely a misunderstanding of the name Christ, but it provides evidence of early Christian presence in Rome and suggests the spread of Christianity, that it caused significant disruption. So again, this supports the New Testament accounts of Christianity's early growth, and also its conflict with Jewish authorities. This expulsion from Rome is specifically referenced in Acts as well, which says, there he, meaning Paul, met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Okay, we're going to move on and talk about Thallus now, who was a Roman historian from the 1st century AD. He wrote about the history of Greece and its relations with Asia from the time of the Trojan War to his own day, which was around 52 AD. And so his original writings are mostly lost, but we still know about them because other writers, like Julius Africanus, reference his work. And so one of the most notable references comes from Africanus's Chronographiae, where he mentions Thallus's work, History. And so Thallus talks about the darkening of the sky around Jesus's crucifixion. It says, "On the whole world there pressed a most dreadful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness Thallus, in the third book of his history, calls, as appears to me, without reason, an eclipse of the sun. For the Jews celebrate the Passover at the time of the full moon, and an eclipse of the sun is not possible at that time." So here, Thallus mentions the darkness that occurred during Jesus' crucifixion, and it suggests that it was caused by an eclipse. However, Julius Africanus, in citing his work, he's disagreeing, pointing out that an eclipse actually wouldn't be possible during a full moon, which is when Passover occurs. And so the thing I want to take away from this is that they are acknowledging the unusual darkening of the sky that happened around Jesus' crucifixion, which Matthew, Mark, and Luke record in their Gospels as well. For example, Luke says, "It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, for the sun stopped shining. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Jesus called out with a loud voice, 'Father, into your hands I commit my spirit.' When he had said this, he breathed his last, and the centurion, seeing what had happened, praised God and said, 'Surely this was a righteous man.'" So the fun thing about Thallus's reference is that even though he's trying to downplay the event's significance by attempting to dismiss it as an eclipse, he's still acknowledging that it happened, right? Let's just keep going. So there's Pliny the Younger. He is a Roman governor and writer who is best known for his letters to the Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century, particularly regarding the treatment of Christians. Gets kind of harsh. So in one letter, Pliny describes his interactions with Christians during the time of the governor Bithynia around 112 AD. He says, "I have asked them if they are Christians, and if they admit it, I repeat the question a second and third time with a warning of the punishment awaiting them. If they persist, I order them to be led away for execution, for, whatever the nature of their admission, I am convinced that their stubbornness and unshakable obstinacy ought not to go unpunished. They also declare that the sum total of their guilt or error amounted to no more than this. They had met regularly before dawn on a fixed day to chant verses alternately amongst themselves in honor of Christ as if to a god, and also to bind themselves by oath, not for any criminal purpose, but to abstain from theft, robbery, and adultery. This made me decide it was all the more necessary to extract the truth by torture from 2 slave women who they called deaconesses. I found nothing but a degenerate sort of cult carried to extravagant lengths." So this passage shows that Pliny viewed Christians as stubborn cult members who he did not like. But it also corroborates the New Testament's depiction of Christians as people who are committed to worshiping Christ as God, as we see in Matthew 28, verse 9, and John 20, verse 28. And then it also confirms that Christians gathered regularly for worship, as we see in Acts 2, verses 42 and 47, and also that Christians upheld ethical standards for living. So in that same letter, Pliny writes about Christians' refusal to worship the emperor instead of Christ. He says, "I asked them to worship the image of the emperor and to curse Christ, and they declared that they had been accustomed to do this until now, and that they had ceased to do so since the instruction of Christ had taught them a better way of life." So again, Pliny confirms that Christians were already established in Asia Minor, or modern-day Turkey, by the early 2nd century, and that they worship Christ, not the local rulers. And this is a nod to what we see throughout the New Testament. One example is in Acts 5, when the Jewish leaders are telling the Christian apostles to stop preaching about Jesus and practicing miracles. And so here's the response. Peter and the other apostles replied, "We must obey God rather than human beings." Okay, switching it up to Jewish sources. We have Josephus. He was a 1st century Jewish historian born in 37 AD. By the age of 19, he became a Pharisee, which is a strict religious leader. And then during the Jewish-Roman War, he ended up commanding Jewish forces, but he was captured by the Romans, and instead of choosing suicide like many of his peers who didn't want to surrender, he did surrender and became a Roman citizen. So by the late first century, he wrote extensively about Jewish history, law, and then Rome's conflict with the Jews. And his most famous works are Antiquities of the Jews and the Jewish War, which cover Jewish history, including Rome's destruction of Jerusalem. And in his writing, we see lots of people, places, and events from the Gospels. One example is that Josephus talks a lot about Herod the Great, who we mentioned last week, in both of those books that I just mentioned. He especially mentions the paranoia and cruelty of Herod. For example, in Antiquities, we see that Herod has killed his own sons because he thinks they're plotting against him. It says, Herod executes his own sons, Alexander and Aristobulus, because he suspects them of plotting against him. We also learn that in later years, Herod he executed some Jewish leaders just to make sure that people would mourn when he died. That's also in Antiquities. It says, Herod's final years were filled with cruelty, including ordering the execution of prominent Jewish leaders upon his death to ensure national mourning. What a nice guy. So these actions line up with the same Herod described in the Gospels, like when Matthew tells us about the what's called the massacre of innocents. It says, when Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious and gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. All right, let's do another example. So in one fell swoop, Josephus also writes about Herod Antipas and John the Baptist, describing Herod's execution of John the Baptist. Antiquities says, Herod, who feared lest the great influence John had over the people might put it into his power and inclination to raise a rebellion, accordingly he sent a prisoner out of Herod's suspicious temper to Machaerus, the castle I before mentioned, and was there put to death. So this is something that the gospel authors, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, also describe. For example, in Mark, it says, finally, the opportune time came. On his birthday, Herod gave a banquet for his high officials and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. When the daughter of Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his dinner guests. The king said to the girl, ask me for anything you want and I'll give it to you. And he promised her with an oath, whatever you ask, I will give you up to half my kingdom. She went out and said to her mother, what shall I ask for? The head of John the Baptist, she answered. And once the girl hurried in to the king with the request, I want you to give me right now the head of John the Baptist on a platter. The king was greatly distressed, but because of his oaths and his dinner guests, he did not want to refuse, so he immediately sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. The man went, beheaded John in the prison, and brought back his head on a platter. He presented it to the girl, and she gave it to her mother. On hearing this, John's disciples came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. So Josephus also writes about Jesus' brother, James, saying he convened a meeting of the Sanhedrin and brought them before a man named James, brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, and certain others. He accused them of having transgressed the law and delivered them up to be stoned. James is mentioned several times in the Gospels and the New Testament as Jesus' brother. I'll give you one of those examples from Matthew 13. It says, isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary? And aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? Okay, and there's more. I know I'm going fast. But Josephus also writes about Pilate a couple times, including in reference to Jesus' crucifixion. It says, about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who wrought surprising feats and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. When Pilate, upon hearing him, accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. On the third day he appeared to them restored to life, for the prophets of God had prophesied these and countless other marvelous things about him, and the tribe of Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. Okay, I'm going to admit that this passage is controversial because Josephus was Jewish, and so it's weird for him to be so complimentary of Christian beliefs. And this makes some scholars think that the passage is authentic because it's in the earliest copies, while others think, though, it's authentic that Josephus is actually mocking Jesus and his followers and using irony. And then there are other scholars who believe that the passage is maybe mostly authentic, but that Christians did add some complementary parts to it, like if indeed one ought to call him a man, or he was the Christ, or on the day he appeared to them restored to life. So it would make the authentic passage, look more like this. Either way, I am not particularly bothered, right? If Josephus was mocking Jesus, or if we remove the parts that are in question, the writing will still confirm that Jesus was a real person, a martyred leader of the church of Jerusalem, that he had a lasting following, that he was crucified under Pilate at the urging of Jewish leaders, and this is all just as the Bible describes. In addition to all this, Josephus's writings back up many people and events from the Gospels, like Judas the Galilean, who is mentioned in Acts, Caiaphas the high priest, who's in the Gospels and who we talked about in the last video, Annas and Paul's trial, the Roman governors of Judea like Festus, and we can keep going, but you get the idea. So the last source I want to talk about is the Mishna, which isn't a single author, but a compilation of Jewish oral laws and traditions, part of the Talmud, which is finalized around AD 200. And this is a Jewish source that doesn't specifically focus on Jesus, but it does include references to events and individuals from the New Testament period. So one passage that's traditionally interpreted as a reference to Jesus reads, "On the eve of Passover, they hanged Yeshu, and the herald went out before him for 40 days, saying, 'He is going to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say anything in his favor, let him come and declare it.' But they found nothing in his favor and hanged him on the eve of Passover." Okay, so here it is believed that Yeshu is a reference to Jesus. And while the Mishnah doesn't explicitly identify this individual as Jesus of Nazareth, the timing of the execution, which was on the eve of Passover, and then accusations of sorcery and leading people astray, these align with the gospel accounts of Jesus' crucifixion, as well as the sometimes hostile perception from the Jewish people towards Christians. As well, the term hung is understood by some scholars to refer to crucifixion, which was the common Roman method of execution at the time. And then the mention of sorcery is important because it acknowledges the amazing things that Jesus did, but explains them as magic rather than as miracles of God, as the Gospels present these things, which kind of reminds me of Thallus ascribing the darkness to an eclipse instead of God. But again, either way, it supports the idea that the historical Jesus was someone who performed acts that were so incredible that they convinced other people to worship him. So the Mishnah also provides historical context for Roman rule in Judea, which matches the mentions of Roman leaders like Pilate and Herod in the New Testament. And then the Mishnah also gives insights into Jewish law and customs, which help explain how religious leaders like, the Pharisees and the Sadducees are portrayed in the Gospels. There are more references I can give, but we've just summarized the most significant ones. So I hope what you're starting to see is that there's a lot of evidence from independent and even hostile sources that support the Bible, and especially the gospel accounts, as reliable historical records. So even if the Gospels were lost, we would have a clear picture of Jesus' life from these sources. Not all the details, but definitely an outline. They would tell us that Jesus was a Jewish teacher who performed miraculous healings, or miraculous seeming, that they worshipped him as God, that they were rejected by Jewish leaders, that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate, that his followers believed that he was alive and spread his teachings, far beyond Judea, and that they worshipped him as God as early as 64 AD. So I know that this information doesn't prove that Christianity is true, but I still think it's helpful because many worldviews are not supported by external evidence like this, which for me does call their credibility into question. Whereas with Christianity, it's just one more piece of evidence in its favor. So in future videos, the goal is to keep exploring other types of evidence, one small piece at a time, And if you are interested in following along with us, you can subscribe so that you will see when there's a new video. And then in the meantime, if you have any questions about this topic or Christianity in general, go ahead and put them in the comments and I will try to respond there or in a future video. And I'll see you next week.